The door creaks as you open it and leads you down the corridor of horror and fear. The footsteps you hear echoing in the empty hallway aren't your own. Are they getting closer? You quicken your step, afraid to glance behind you. Before you know it, you've left the reality you've known far behind and crossed over into Tales from the Shadow Realm. Philip had spent all day hiking and was now getting tired. He looked up at the sun and realized it would soon be dark. He had gone hiking alone that day, which was not his usual practice, but none of his friends would come with him because it was All Hallows Eve. They said it was the night when vengeful spirits and monsters inhabited these woods. Philip had only laughed off their fears. How could anyone in this day and age be so superstitious, he wondered. So Philip set off hiking that morning alone. He wasn't worried. After all, he knew these woods like the back of his hand. Now, as he glanced up in the sky, he wished he hadn't started this hike. Not because he was afraid of ghosts or ghouls, but because it looked like it was going to rain. No, it looked worse than rain. It looked like it was going to pour. Philip knew he had to get home before the sky opened up. He quickened his pace. It wasn't long before he felt the first drop. Soon, Philip was running blindly through a humongous downpour. The forest no longer felt friendly and familiar. Instead, it became a slippery mass of mud. Philip struggled to walk through the sucking mud and the pouring rain that felt like icy daggers against his skin. He could barely see through the rain, so he didn't see that he should have turned instead of continuing to go straight. His next step fell upon nothing. Suddenly, Philip found himself falling at an alarming rate, slipping and sliding down a hill with a steep slope along what felt like tons of mud, rocks, and debris. All that debris pounded Philip's poor body mercilessly until he reached the bottom and passed out. When he came to some time later, the forest was calm and dark. Night had fallen. This wasn't the normal calm that came with night. Philip listened to the atmosphere carefully. He could not hear a single animal around him. There were no crickets, no birds, nothing. He knew that meant that the storm wasn't over yet. Animals had a sixth sense about these things, and they never came out before it was. He had to find a place to take shelter from the storm. He glanced up in the sky and noticed that in addition to the storm, the moon was pure red. This was known as a blood moon, and people in town were actually very much afraid of blood moons. They said that supernatural creatures came out in blood moons, and the fact that it was All Hallows Eve didn't exactly help the situation. But Philip wasn't superstitious, and he didn't care about blood moons or All Hallows Eve. What he did notice was that the moon's fullness and its redness gave everything a eerie, unnatural appearance. For the first time, Philip felt a chill creep up his spine. He had to get out of here. As he got to his feet groggily, he looked around. He actually had no idea where here was, and that surprised him. He thought he knew every part of this forest. But now, here he was in a part of the forest he'd never seen before. He told himself that he was just tired, that he did know this part of the forest, he just didn't recognize it at the moment. He told himself that once he got a good night's sleep, everything would make sense again. He pulled out his cell phone to see where he was. Only he was shocked to discover that the cell phone screen had been cracked in the fall, rendering it useless. Aggravated, Philip stuffed the cell phone back in his pocket. The eerie quiet around him was broken by the sound of heavily rustling leaves. The wind was back. and that meant the rest of the storm would be back soon, too. Philip looked around for any place he could hide, perhaps a cave. Then, in the distance, he saw something. It was a light. And it wasn't just any light. It was the light like you'd see from a house. Excitedly, Philip raced towards the light. It didn't take long for him to reach the house, but it was the smallest house Philip had ever seen. And it had no lights on. It also looked like no one had lived in this house for years. Undaunted, Philip approached the front door and knocked loudly. Above the door was a small wooden plaque, though many of its words were obscured by what looked like deep scratches. 2 words were still visible on the plaque: Safehouse. Well, that's good enough for me, thought Philip as he tried to see if the door was unlocked. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. Slowly, he pushed open the door and went inside. Did anyone still live in this house? It didn't look like it. He felt around for a light switch on the wall and realized there wasn't one. This house wasn't wired for electricity at all. He wasn't sure if that was because it was so old, or if its owners had peculiar preferences. Since it was only a one-room house, he could see clearly that nobody was in it. It didn't look like anybody had lived in it for decades. He could also see a small bed in the far corner. A bed. Until this moment, Philip hadn't realized how truly exhausted he was. Since no one was here, he decided to spend the night. With great effort, Philip closed the creaky door. There seemed to be some kind of self-latching lock on it, like the type you'd see on a gate. The latch locked into place as Philip heaved the door shut. Good thing it didn't self-latch prior to his arrival, or he wouldn't have been able to get in at all. Now that Philip was safe from the storm, he decided to remove some of his wet clothing. Slowly, he took off his backpack and jacket before deciding to check out the bed. Surprisingly, the bed had linens, a blanket, and a pillow complete with the pillowcase still on it. Just what Philip needed. He removed his shoes, picked up his bag, and sat down on the bed. After rummaging through his bag for several seconds, he took out what was left of his trail mix and water. Hungrily, he began to eat. As he ate, he looked around the room. He hadn't noticed before, but the entire room, all 4 walls, were filled with portraits. They were the creepy type of portraits with the eyes that follow you everywhere. But it was more than just the eyes that were creepy. The portraits themselves seemed to be of evil people. He could see the cruelness and even sadism marked on their faces. Some of the portraits were even so grotesque or almost weren't human. Did he see that one move? Philip felt another chill crawl up his spine. He'd attributed it to the fact that he was cold, wet, and tired. Everything was going to look brighter in the morning, he was sure of it. After he finished his dinner, he lay down on the bed and tried to sleep. But it wasn't so easy to sleep with those evil portraits staring at him all night. After all, they lined all 4 walls. Determined, he closed his eyes and waited for sleep to come. Just as he was starting to drift off, he thought he heard scratching at the door. He also heard a moaning and a wailing. Was something trying to get in? No, Philip told himself. It was just a dream. Who wouldn't have nightmares with all these creepy portraits staring at him? Once more, he tried to sleep. Just as he was starting to doze, he thought he heard a voice whispering, "Come with us." Philip sat up with a start. Did he really just hear that? He glanced around. If possible, those portraits were looking even angrier and crueler. But he decided it was just the wind. His ears were playing tricks on him. At last, Philip fell into a fitful sleep. All night long, scratching, wailing, moaning, and whispering pervaded his dreams. He even dreamt of a voice hissing, "Leave the safe house. Join us outside." When Philip awoke in the morning, he felt much better. The birds were singing and sunlight poured into the room from its many windows. Windows? That's right. What Philip had thought were frames for paintings were actually frames for windows. In reality, there was not a single painting in the whole house.